Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another amazing episode of Lead to Greatness, where we believe in helping others reach their greatest potential and together change the world. Today on Lead to Greatness, we have Hart Kaminker. Hart is the founder of Kaminker Associates, a full-service boutique immigration law firm that helps individuals and businesses with relocation to Canada. He helps biotechs, healthcare companies, and institutions needing to bring skilled workers from out of the country to work in their companies. Hart brings nearly 3 decades of experience in immigration and citizenship law, earning himself a reputation of a compassionate and highly skilled immigration lawyer. He works directly with clients to help them understand what is expected in their cases. If this is your first time joining us, consider subscribing to this channel. Hit that like button and click the notification bell so you won't miss any amazing episodes. Please help me welcome Hart with immigration law. This is Cedric Francis, and you're listening to Lead to Greatness.
I did my undergraduate at the University of Western Ontario, which is in London, Ontario, which is about 2 hours. It's halfway between Toronto and Detroit. And they did immigration. There was 2 young lawyers, a little bit older than me at the time, and still, and they were looking for some help. And so they did primarily immigration, and that's how I got into it, because that's where I found work and just took off from there. It's a stressful field because you're dealing with people's lives, but you're dealing with people's lives as far as them making a decision, that's going to fundamentally change their lives. And, people often are looking to immigrate for any number of reasons, one of which might be family reunification, but often, they're looking for something better than where they are right now. Yeah. And, they have a lot riding on whether or not their application is going to be successful. And, and I've often told people, and certainly young students that have come through my office, that it's an interesting field because it's black and white. Either you're in or you're out. It's not like some other areas of law, like litigation, where you might get sued and you get a good result, maybe because you get a big settlement, or if you're the defendant, you don't have to pay all that much. Right. So we're a family law where you're looking for a settlement as well. So there's no gray. It's black or white, and either you're in or you're out. And I think that also adds to the stress. The other side of the coin is it's very rewarding. So, helping people, realize their dream about being able to be here. Some are, fleeing persecution, so the stakes are really high. So it's very rewarding in that way. And I think, when you have days where, and everybody does, I think when they're working in a profession, I think you say like this is just too much, or it's been a bad day, right, or maybe a bad couple of days. And you say, look, you can look back. I can look back on the many, hundreds, if not thousands of people I've helped over the years, and like a story, which came up maybe in the last couple of years. I had a client who had some criminal issues, and there's an intersection between criminal law and immigration, because if you're a criminal, you can't necessarily stay in Canada. Right. And the criminal lawyer called me about it, and somebody much younger than myself, and he says, "I don't think you remember me." And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, you helped my family." This was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. He says, "I was very young." He was like 4 or 5. Here he was a lawyer, criminal lawyer in Toronto. Well, I think one of the suburbs of Toronto, practicing law. And that was like good to hear. Like, here, he came, his family came looking for a better life. And here he was, he grew up to be a lawyer. And, it was gratifying to know that, that these are the results that happen that you don't see, because, people, their clients, they get in, they leave. I mean, they'll send their relatives or their friends to you, but you don't really have a long-term connection with them. And so it was very gratifying for me to hear that story. People are, I think, overall, welcoming to immigrants in Canada. And I think there are, many, many really good stories of people who have come and really contributed, tremendously, to Canada, whether from a business point of view, or whether from a science point of view, or even from, giving back to the community from, a social point of view, helping people. So I think that there are lots of good stories, and I think overall immigration is viewed positively in Canada. I think by all political streams. I mean, we don't have the same extremes as you do in the United States up here, our parties aren't quite as divergent, but I think, on both sides of the political spectrum, generally welcoming to immigrants and their
And
importance to Canada and its growth.
let's talk about your firm. What inspired you to begin this journey and why?
When I started on my own, I'd worked for somebody else for 12 years. It's a long time ago now. And I just, thought it was time for me to do my own thing. And so I struck out on my own. And at that time, it was just me and a part-time assistant working 2 to 3 days a week. And then, things grew from there. I mean, thank God, a lot of satisfied customers, which led to other customers.
Wow.
And I took on a full-time assistant, and then eventually on a lawyer, somebody who had been a student for me, which necessitated us to take on another assistant, and then a third assistant to help us out. So it just sort of was like a natural growth from there. Just that there were a lot of files, and obviously I couldn't do them all myself. It just grew. It was sort of natural growth, not like really, I would say the vast majority of it coming from word of mouth. So relatives, friends of people that I had assisted in the past, and just grew from there. I think it's very satisfying to start something that's not very big and then, grow it, in a managed way over time, and to see what you've grown as that time passes. I think and it's fun too. I mean, it's a lot of fun. I think there's a lot of stress, as I said before, as you move through that process. But I think at the end of the day, the satisfaction comes with a lot of fun.
So when you started your firm, because I know you mentioned growth, was there any shortcomings at the time, struggles at the time, or you went right into it?
When I came out on my own, I was very well versed in the litigation type of work in immigration, so asylum claims, reviewing refusals in Canada's federal court. That's where I had the bulk of my experience, the people that I had worked with previously. So definitely there was a learning curve, in doing other things. So processing, so work permits, permanent resident applications, other things like that. And I think like anything, the first couple that you do, it takes you a long, long time. As you get to learn how to do them, then obviously you're more efficient at doing them. And I think that goes with any area of the law, not just this area. I think the other challenges that you have in immigration, and probably in other areas as well, but certainly immigration is that the criteria to immigrate, is forever changing, and the process in which you file an application is forever changing. So you've always got to be adapting. It's like a never-ending learning process that's going on. And the growth challenges. So, trying to manage growth so that you don't get too busy, because that can be a problem as well.
Right.
And understanding, where, okay, we need more help here now, because this isn't something that I can necessarily handle on my own. And being able to find a young lawyer or students, and being able to find, assistants who are and paralegals who have the skills to, give the assistance to help the firm along.
That's awesome. You mentioned skills, and I want to talk about that. What characteristics, quality, and values do you think every great leader should have?
So I think it's a good question. I think a good leader needs to be empathetic. I think you need to I think understand people who are working for you, their emotions, when I think you're trying to address those issues that may arise in the course of running and operating a firm. I think as well, I think being decisive, this is what we're going to do, and this is the direction that we're going to go. And I think making decisions and being able to learn to live with those decisions. Like, reality is not every single decision that you're going to make is going to be perfect. And I think that's the other thing, to be nimble. So to understand that something may not be working out quite the way that you envisioned it, that it was going to work out. Be nimble. You have to be able to change. Where you see that things aren't necessarily, decisions that you've made aren't necessarily working out the way that you see. And I think certainly the pandemic, was a huge challenge that you had to rise to as a leader. Quickly changing from an in-person office to a remote office. We're now sort of back in person now. Not all of us together at once, but everybody, some staff is in here every day. Hopefully, we'll be all back here at once, maybe in the new year. But I think that, being able to sort of recognize what needed to be done. And I think they're sort of trying to maintain a positive view, in light of everything that was going on, and, just plowing ahead and perhaps making the people that work for you feel comfortable that things are going to continue to move ahead. And so that definitely was I think for anybody who was leading any kind of business, was a very challenging time. But if I were to take it, I think decisive, being nimble, I think, being empathetic, I think these are all qualities that a strong leader has. And I think making people feel that they're part of what's happening here, and that everybody, regardless of what their title is or what their education is or what their background is, plays an important role in, the operation of the firm. And so making people understand that they're important and that what they're doing is important overall to the operation of the firm, and that they're contributing. Everybody's contributing in some way.
I want to speak to that company that's hiring individuals. Why should the HR department reach out to work with a immigration law firm like yours to help hire candidates?
So I think, if an HR department is looking to hire someone who is, not a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, so therefore doesn't have permission to work in Canada, I think it's important to reach out to a lawyer. And the reasons is that partly for what I said previously, I mean, the regulations are ever changing. So it's a constant learning process. And, being able to know that you're dealing with somebody who's up to date, who does it all day, every day, and who understands the intricacies and the nuances that are involved in the process. So, because I think it's not good for a company who's looking to hire somebody to perhaps have their HR people go through the process themselves, and then to discover that perhaps they missed a point or missed a nuance or intricacy, and finds that their application is refused, and that this person that they wanted to get into Canada to work, may be delayed in getting to Canada, which could perhaps not, but it will likely is not a good thing for the company. So I think it's just, having the knowledge of those regulations. And I think as well, being able to guide them, with respect to what the right path is to try to get that person into their position, because there might be more than one path, and being able to identify the path of, I think, least resistance, and in order to make it as easy as possible for the employer to get somebody here.
Is it easy to immigrate to Canada?
So that's a good question. I think it really depends on your qualifications. So what I would say is that the system is definitely, in my view, I think other lawyers may share the same view, but the system is definitely tilted towards people who have studied and worked in Canada. So if you've studied in Canada, and then after you finish your studies, you get an opportunity to work in Canada, you work. Or if you've worked in Canada, let's say you worked somewhere else before you've come to Canada, those will definitely give you a pretty decent pathway to immigration in Canada. Otherwise, if you're, relatively young, have good education, that could also provide a pathway to Canada as well. So I think the answer to the question is, if you've studied and worked in Canada, then usually, not always, but usually you're going to, there should be a pathway for immigration. The other issue is really, what's in demand in Canada at any particular point in time. Some of the programs are linked to particular occupations where workers are needed. So, if you're working in those kinds of occupations, then you've also got a pathway potentially to Canada as well.
Wow, that's awesome. So how many Americans are successful in immigrating to Canada?
Yes, so I think Americans are generally successful in immigrating to Canada. The issue still remains that, as far as immigration is concerned, to a large extent, they have to meet the same criteria that anybody else immigrating from any other country. And having said that, because of the free trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, as far as getting into Canada on a work permit, which, as I mentioned before, can give you a pathway to immigration ultimately, it's a little bit easier. There's definitely easier for some occupations, not all of them, but for some occupations to get into Canada. Maybe the paperwork, so to speak, or the red tape, whatever you want to call it, would be a lot less. So to that extent, I think there is a little bit of an easier pathway to get in, but I think Americans, for the most part, whether they're coming as professional people or they're reuniting with spouses in Canada, that overall successful in getting to Canada. Permanent resident of Canada, you're going to remain, like the first step is permanent residence, which would be like green card, same if you're looking for something equivalent. And there you obviously maintain your citizenship. You could live in Canada, as a permanent resident for the rest of your life and never become a Canadian citizen. You would remain an American citizen. If you chose to become a Canadian citizen, Canada does allow, right now anyway, does allow people to hold more than one, to have citizenships other than Canadian.
Wow. You mentioned earlier, you talked about a criminal background. So let's say something like a DUI here in the U.S. Is it possible to come to Canada if someone have a DUI here in the U.S.?
So the answer is it's possible, but there would have to be a extra, depending on how old the DUI is. If it's relatively recent, that could be a significant barrier to getting into Canada. If it's older, 5 years, 10 years ago, perhaps an indiscretion when somebody was younger, it would be possible, but there would be steps that that person would need to take in order to be granted entry into Canada. So if you've got a DUI on your record, you can't really just show up at the border and say, I'd like to come in, because you might very well be told, no, you can't come in, you got to go back to the US. But there would be a process whereby you could try to eliminate that barrier. So I guess the answer to the question is not necessarily, it's possible, but not necessarily.
Wow.
I think that would definitely be a case where somebody's going to seek the advice of a lawyer. If you've got a criminal record, that can be a bar to being able to get into Canada, without a question, without question. So if you've got a criminal record, you could very well, probably, you would be turned back at the border, because people with criminal records are inadmissible to Canada. There may be ways to cure that. And really, if you're, the way to cure it is, I often, the technical term is called rehabilitation. And again, as I mentioned before, whether you're eligible for it or not depends on how recent or how long ago the criminal conviction or convictions were. But rehabilitation is, I kind of sort of characterize it as an immigration pardon. I mean, basically, you have to write to the government, got to show what your criminal convictions are. You've got to explain the circumstances of those convictions. You've got to explain why you've rehabilitated, why you're not a danger, to Canadian society, that you're not going to reoffend when you're in Canada. So you have to provide, it's a relatively rigorous process that you have to go through in order to, to be able to be granted that rehabilitation. I mean, in emergency situations, if that's what you want to, if that's a term to describe it, where somebody actually absolutely has to be in Canada, and the rehabilitation is just not going to happen fast enough, because that's a process that does take time. There is a permit that would allow you to come into Canada, but again, a lot would depend upon what the natures of the convictions are, and what your reason for coming into Canada is, for how long you're going to be in Canada. These are all things that they would take into consideration. I mean, if somebody's committed a crime, presumably there's a warrant for their arrest, I guess, and there could be, it's a little bit of a different situation. I mean, it'd be like an extradition, which is sort of moving out of the immigration area, an extradition back to the US possibly. But I think somebody who's, committed a crime, and look, it happens, I wouldn't say regularly, but probably more regularly than people think. Obviously drug convictions, DUIs, other things that people, unfortunately have indiscretions in their life. They make mistakes, and, often, not always, but often the mistake is isolated, right? It's, one DUI, they made a mistake, and nevertheless, that mistake, prevents them from coming into Canada. And as I said, there is a process by which that barrier could be removed.
How can America benefit from Canadian immigration?
I think as far as Americans coming to Canada, I mean, there's a few ways. I mean, if people want to come to Canada, there could be economic ties, I guess, between, it might help foster economic ties and trade between Canada and the US. So if you have an American company that's looking to come up to Canada, that, to make a product or do some kind of business, that could foster economic ties. I think often immigration is based on, fostering economic ties, between countries in which immigration occurs between Canada and that other country. So whether that's business ties, export, imports, movement of knowledge, other things like that, that I think overall, can benefit both countries, or any country in which Canada, has people immigrating from.
Awesome. So, Hart, if someone wanted to reach out to your immigration firm, what can they expect?
good hands-on service. So we're not a huge business, as apparent in how I've described the firm during the conversation. So you're going to deal like often, like you're going to deal with me. If you're my client, you're going to deal with me. I'm going to, in most cases, answer the phone, and in most cases, answer your emails. Not always. Sometimes the assistant does, but if you want to speak to me, certainly you're going to have the ability to be able to speak to me. So it's not a case of somebody comes, they hire me, and then that's the last they see of me, because they're dealing with other people in the firm. And I think the same with the other lawyers that are in the firm. So you're going to deal with those lawyers again directly or hands-on. So I think you're going to get personal service and and attentive service. And I think as well you're going to get the benefit of many years of my experience of having seen many things over that almost 30 years that I've practiced. So that helps because it helps you understand where there are pitfalls and where mistakes have been made before. And so it helps me help clients avoid those pitfalls as they move through the process. But I think most importantly, I think our size means that you're not sort of lost in a big place. You're in a personal place, and the person that you hire is the person you're going to deal with.
Hart, that's awesome, awesome, awesome. What are some leadership growth tips, tools, advice that you can share with the Lead to Greatness community to help us reach our greatest potential?
One thing that I would say, not so much anymore, but maybe I'll get back into it. But I did sit on the boards of some different organizations, and number one, I think sitting on a board, and you might not be the vice president or the chair, you might be a member at large or sitting on a subcommittee, but I think it allows you to see, I think, other leaders and how other leaders lead. And I think looking, and saying like, that's a really good way that this person is leading, or, and I think one of the things I definitely learned with that is, always, listening and let them know that you're listening to them. So one thing that I did learn was, when you make a decision, to explain why you've made the decision, not just say this is the decision that you have to live with it. This is why I've made a decision. So I think sort of getting out and doing those community activities, I think, is a really great way to meet other leaders in the community and to learn from them. So I think that would be a tip. And I definitely learned. I definitely learned from people that I met along the way, who were, at the time, maybe 10, 20 years older than me, had a lot more experience in life. And I think that's the other thing, I think it's just life experience, really, when you've experienced life, I think that makes you, if you take those experiences, both positive and negative, and learn from them, then I think that also helps you be a good leader. So I think you've got to learn from your mistakes. I think that's the other thing. I think 100%, you can't be afraid to make mistakes, and you got to learn from them. In other words, not to sort of deflect. Maybe that's not really my fault, but to understand, okay, yeah, I've got some responsibility here. What can I do differently next time? And so I think that would be another lesson. So I think learning from other people in the community, and I think understanding, where you've gone wrong and reflecting on that and being able to do better next time. You've got to go through life, I think, treating people with respect, and not always, but I think the vast majority of the time, that if you do that, people are going to treat you likewise. And I think as well, I think it's really important, like one thing that I really try to teach the young lawyers that have passed through my office over the years, is that like you have to take responsibility for what you've done. And look, mistakes are going to happen, or not, and not necessarily mistakes, but you take a strategy that didn't really work out that well. It's not necessarily a mistake, it's just you did a strategy that didn't work out that well. And I think being able to learn from that, I think it's important not to, because I think sometimes people deflect, like, well, that wasn't really me, that was this other person. And I think if you don't take that kind of responsibility, then I don't think you're going to grow in your profession, and I don't think you're going to grow as a leader. And I think that would be, I think, really the most important thing. I think really being able to learn from what you experience in life is really the most important thing. And I think that everybody who sort of works in my office, or even works in the building that my office is in, everybody, has an important role to play, and everybody's doing something that's important. And I think, people who, if people feel that they're valued, then I think the way that they're ultimately going to that they're going to react to you is going to be a lot more positive.
Absolutely. If someone wants to connect with you and what you're doing, where should they go?
So the best way I think to go, they can go to our website, which is kaminkerlaw.com, and then you'll be able to connect with us through there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. On behalf of the Lead to Greatness community, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule and adding value to us all.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And don't forget to subscribe to Lead to Greatness if this is your first time. And this podcast was helpful to you, leave a big thumbs up. And also, I want you to check out our Marriage Coach podcast, the podcast with my wife and I. If you're on iTunes, please rate this podcast and leave a review and help get the word out. Again, thank you, Lead to Greatness Nation, for joining us on today. Looking forward to seeing you again on next week. Till then, remember, if you help others reach their greatest potential, together we can change the world. Peace. We out.